To begin our consideration of Charles Dickens' novel Great Expectations, it's useful to compare and contrast in a very general way some of its distinguishing features to the last novel that we studied, Jane Austen's Emma. These works belong to the same literary family, but they were also written a good 50 years apart from each other, so there are certain changes that are becoming evident in the novel form when we look at Dickens. A lot of these changes have to do with the way novelists are expanding the subject matter of their works, broadening the field of things and persons, places and ideas that can be brought into literary representation in a realistic way. At the same time that these developments are happening, we also see in Dickens' novel a more intent and narrow focus on the uniqueness of the individual voice, a growing interest in the psychological, social, and environmental influences that shape personal identity, and new ways of narrativizing the largely interior drama that is experienced and felt by individual characters who are undergoing a complex process of becoming a person, becoming a subject of value, not just in their own society, but also worthy of engaging the reader's personal interest and capacity for sympathy. As students of the theory of the novel, then, an understanding of the novel's literary history provides a good foundation for further speculation. While the half-century that separates a novel like Emma from that of Great Expectations represents a crucial development in the English novel of the 19th century, we can step back even further from this historical moment to get a sense of a general literary trend away from the depiction of gods and heroes to that of the humbler kind of human characters who matter most to the modern-day novelist. Let's begin then with a classic distinction in literary history. In Greek antiquity, a form of epic poetry developed out of an oral tradition best exemplified by Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. The form is usually referred to as epos, E-P-O-S, a word you may remember George Eliot using in a somewhat different context in her preface to the novel Middlemarch. The content of the epos featured the deeds of gods and men, and not just any men, but heroic men and their glorious deeds. Think about Achilles and King Agamemnon, for instance, leading their legions of Greek soldiers into battle against the Trojans in the Iliad, or Odysseus navigating his way back from that war in Homer's Odyssey, or Aeneas in the Roman epic by Virgil called the Aeneid. Early English literature adopted the form of the epos for its own cultural purposes and entertainment, as well as for mythologizing the founding of kingdoms and races of people. Here we can think about Sir Gawain and his mortal struggle with the Green Knight, or we can think about Sir Lancelot and King Arthur, and even Beowulf in his defeat of the monster Grendel and Grendel's mother. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales introduces us to far less heroic characters, taking a stage devoid of gods, mysterious monsters, and exotic locations. In many ways, Chaucer's tales of traveling friars, merchants, cooks, millers, monks, and other people anticipates the modern novel simply by giving voice and individuality to such characters, and by making them important figures in the overall narrative. Opening the literary field of representation to ordinary people as a hallmark of the realist novels that we're reading, but it is one that comes with its own set of challenges. As Guido Mazzoni points out in his theory of the novel, unlike gods and heroes, regular human beings are legion. They are born in obscurity, unrecorded in the historical record, subject to the cyclic movement of nature and time, which replaces particular individuals with other equivalent ones. This is the brutal law governing the condition of all ephemeral human beings who have ever lived or will live. Mazzoni sums this up by saying we have people in general and people en masse, and then we have particular individuals. Our physical bodies belong to nature, but our proper names belong to culture. As we are coming to speak about them in this course, novels and their choice of protagonists and other characters might be said to be a crucial part of the cultural process that brings particular people out of the mass of undifferentiated human beings and celebrates, investigates, dignifies, or memorializes the limitless variety of their individualism. While the biological existence of bodies puts all individuals on an equal footing by condemning them all to death, the cultural existence of names has the capacity to give a different weight to each human being, bringing differences into relief in the collective and individual memory. The attempt to resist the annihilation of death, Mazzoni theorizes, and the will to distinguish oneself in life ultimately respond to the same desire, to stand out from the obscure background or the mortal condition, to push back from the limits that imprison beings who are subject to the physical conditions of life. The novelist's decision to represent a particular life or lives is driven by a belief that particular actions, people, or things, whether real or possible, deserve to capture our attention, deserve to be isolated from the limitless expanse of equivalent entities. The novel is the literary form most invested with the idea that some living beings deserve the distinction of leaving a trace behind from the infinite mass of beings who remain unnoticed. Well, how do novels do this so powerfully? The individual, or individuals represented in a novel, have bodies, which means they must be subject to all the contingencies and limitations of everyday real life if they're to be represented realistically. Just think here of Pip's physical smallness when we first meet him at the beginning of Great Expectations, and how that leaves him vulnerable to the assault of the escaped criminal on the marshes in that opening scene, or to the physical and mental abuse of his older sister, who at this early stage of his story is a much more intimidating figure, and so on and so forth. In other words, to be represented realistically, characters like this must be located somewhere in space and time. And the default span of time in many cases is that between the individual's birth and death. The plot of the novel is the hyphen connecting those two dates, or a segment of time within those two dates, as is the case of Pip in Dickens' novel, as well as of Emma in Jane Austen's. To simulate life as the response to the changes that occur over these passages of time, the particular individual represented in fiction must begin with an imbalance that needs to be righted. If the character has a given name, this immediately anchors that character into a family lineage and makes the character a subject to the laws and customs of their society. But sometimes, even coming into the world with a certain proper name is not quite enough to render and make that person fully human, developed, or capable of acquiring social value in the community. So the instability of the name itself becomes a focus of intense interest and drama. Both Emma and Great Expectations are novels that share this general goal of bringing particularity and individuality into literary representation as a stand against the anonymous mass of people who live and die throughout time. And both of them notably place their respective characters within actual physical and geographical locations as a kind of first gesture in establishing their identities. Both novels also begin with the utterance of proper names, but in very different ways, of course. Austen begins her novel with the words Emma Woodhouse, a full Christian and surname, the first also coinciding with the title of the novel itself. You'll recall the opening lines of the novel, Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever, and rich, with a comfortable home, happy disposition, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence, and had lived nearly 21 years in the world with very little to distress or vex her. When you compare this to the opening lines of Great Expectations, you might wonder why the novel isn't just called Pip or Philip Pirrip, because it is his own fictional autobiography after all. Instead of a name of a person, though, we get an aspiration, great expectations, a promise, or an ironic warning, or a prospect. The book opens, "My father's family name being Pirrip and my Christian name Philip, my infant tongue could make of both names nothing longer or more explicit than Pip. So I called myself Pip and came to be called Pip." The difference here is notable for a number of reasons. First of all, Dickens obviously is telling this story in the first person, and Austen tells hers in the third person. And one immediate effect of this technical alteration is that when we hear the narrator's assured use of the name Emma Woodhouse, we feel we're being presented with a known quantity, or an already finished person, about whom there is little more to learn, or little more that the character can learn about herself. And even though we soon discover Emma does have something to learn, the degree of that learning is not on the same large scale as that of Pip's. Emma comes into life with a very stable identity and name compared to Pip's having to name himself and be named by others in a way that never puts him in full possession of his family name. It's a mark of how far we have come in the art and cultural power of the novel between Jane Austen and Charles Dickens to consider how the criteria of personal identity emerges as a prominent subject of novels. Austen, for example, tells us right away what those criteria are and how Emma meets them. In fact, she represents them as if their stability and their regularity go without saying in the case of the main character, and only addresses possible irregularities in her minor characters like Harriet Smith or Jane Fairfax. By contrast, the much more precarious situation of Pip in Dickens' novel is front and center, and his struggle with self-identity is conveyed in his own voice throughout the novel. Emma has a name that links her to an old, prominent family. At the same time, it individualizes her as a distinct person within that family, and by extension, within her smaller community. She has, in other words, been named beforehand, as if a place in the world has already been prepared for her existence and value in it. She has a living father and a sister. She has in-laws and nephews. She has health, beauty, and wit. She doesn't have to travel very far or become dislocated for any period of time. In Great Expectations, we're presented with a protagonist who is bereft of all these reassuring markers of personal identity. And even though Pip is part of a biological family, his parents and brothers are all dead, and his guardian older sister is a poor surrogate for a nurturing mother. A detail of clothing with regard to Mrs. Joe tells the whole story. "My sister, Mrs. Joe, with black hair and eyes, had such a prevailing redness of skin that I sometimes used to wonder whether it was possible she washed herself with a nutmeg grater instead of soap. She was tall and bony, and almost always wore a coarse apron. An apron which is fastened over her figure behind with 2 loops and having a square impregnable bib in front that was stuck full of pins and needles." If anything, the choice of the spiked impregnable bib on Dickens' part amplifies the prevention or the removal of nurturing, of feeding, or the attachment to the mother. It's also apparent that Mrs. Joe has no children of her own after several years of marriage to Gargery. This absence creates a lack that drives a desire to replace it or to fill it. So we see Pip cling to Jo for protection. Later, when Pip is being mercilessly criticized at the holiday dinner table by Mr. Pumblechook and others, only Jo keeps slipping him more gravy. But as a surrogate father figure, Jo is as inadequate in his way as Mrs. Jo is as a mother figure. He is as much a child as Pip is. He's bullied and emasculated by the woman who has appropriated his male name as her own. Later, she will be rendered a simpleton when she's attacked in her own home. Pip, in other words, must navigate far more ambiguous influences in the process of his individuation, making this novel a drama of self in the making compared to the more stable environment in which Emma knows herself and is known by others. The difference has to do, of course, with the 50-year distance between the two novels, a half-century of demographic transformation, economic changes, and the peculiar conditions of urban life that form much of the setting of Great Expectations. What is that setting? Why does the novel begin where it does? And where does it go from there? Why is the geographical region in which Dickens chooses to introduce us to Pip significant, both in regard to the part of England it is and its potential for exerting a strong set of symbolic associations that will become an inextricable component of the themes and the protagonist of this novel? This map of England shows in red the county of Surrey, where all of the action of the novel Emma takes place. Just to the east and a bit to the north is County Kent, where the events of Great Expectations largely take place. Although the events depicted in Great Expectations take place in the early 1820s, not too long after those of Emma, the novel was written in 1860, a full 2 generations after Jane Austen's death. We are also dealing in Great Expectations with a far different social class, the lower working class of blacksmiths, clerks, small merchants, criminals, lawyers, tailors, school teachers, and the like. Where are we geographically, and why does it matter? Well, one thing you might recall from Emma is that description of the English landscape that we're given from the perspective of Mr. Knightley's Donwell Abbey estate in County Surrey. And I quote, "It was a sweet view, sweet to the eye and the mind, English verdure, English culture, English comfort, seen under a sun bright without being oppressive." End quote. In Great Expectations, compared to the setting of Emma, we're located slightly north and east of Highbury. We are close to the city of London on the estuary of the Thames River that empties into the North Sea. Literary landscapes are important components of a novel's setting, and in considering them, we should think about 2 things, topography and geography. Topography refers to the physical details of a place, while geography captures the features of human distribution over the earth and the effects of human activity. In the literary descriptions that we have seen, topographical features lend themselves to symbolic or metaphorical significance. For example, the orderly layout of Highbury Village, the highly cultivated large estates like Donwell Abbey and Hartfield, the farms and meadows, the greenery of the place. Geographically, these places describe the social composition of the occupying human population, what people do or not do for employment, their material resources or needs, the economic activities suggested by the location. Hence, the geography of Emma is primarily agricultural as opposed to industrial. It's a place where large parcels of land are privately owned. There are shops that get their goods from nearby London, and presumably those goods from London occasionally include things from overseas, which requires a shipping industry, ports of entry, trade negotiations between states. Highbury is at some remove from these commercial and merchant activities, so they recede into the less visible but deeper structures of Jane Austen's worldview and her art. The topography and the geography of northeast Kent, as it's described in Great Expectations, tells a rather different story. Obviously, each of the novelists we're studying knew these places intimately, and the circumstances of their birth and their experiences are the primary reason for setting their work in these specific locations. But having said that, Dickens was a very good writer, good enough to extract symbolic significance from the landscape that he describes. Marshland, for instance, is neither wholly water nor wholly solid ground, but a loose combination of both. Marshland suggests the sea level where land meets the ocean, something much lower, much foggier than the ascent, say, of Box Hill in Emma, whereas the characters who make that ascent are all fairly secure already in terms of material support, marriage, friendship, family, and social relations. They gain an even wider prospect of their world from the top of Box Hill. Even Miss Bates is in company, and even the servants who attend this party of leisure seekers have jobs they can rely on and households that offer them security. I want to suggest something about the literal and figurative meaning contained in the word prospect. When we speak about our prospects, we unconsciously assume we have a future that we can shape to our own will. We can see or imagine we can see what lies around us, what lies before us. When the standpoint of this thinking being is flat, the horizon appears monotonously flat as well, stretching away horizontally, betraying no heights or prospects. Moreover, in addition to these limited prospects, the landscape in which we encounter Pip for the first time is treacherously unstable, loose, dark, and whatever advance he makes in it leads inevitably to the sea. The sea is obviously fluid, deep, and has a powerfully dissoluting effect, a dissolving effect that drowns the individual body into a vast nothingness. How does a character born into the very atmosphere of dissolution counteract the forces of nothingness to become something? How does a boy like Pip, with no prospects, literally and figuratively, expect anything great to happen? At the top of this slide is a map showing the distance between the city of London, where Pip goes to live as a newly minted gentleman, and the seaside marshland to the east, where we first find him as a blacksmith's apprentice living with Mrs. Joe and her husband Gargery. Below that is an expanded inset of the marshland area, where the River Thames empties into the sea routes that lead to the French port of Calais and the commercial ports of Bruges and Rotterdam. This estuary would also be a main shipping port for sending prisoners to Australia, where Magwitch has been sent to a penal colony. Note the location of Gad's Hill. This is the general location of Charles Dickens' birthplace, and Gad's Hill is the name of the estate he purchased as a successful author later in life. Dickens was born in 1812. The location was well-known territory for Dickens, and there is reason to believe there are strong autobiographical elements in Great Expectations. In fact, one of his concerns in writing the book was that he might be in danger of repeating material he had used in a previous autobiographical novel called David Copperfield. The landscapes of Great Expectations put us in a very different England from that of Jane Austen's world. Whereas we only hear about London from a distance in Emma, the great city is central to the second and third volumes of Great Expectations. The contrast and the tensions between country life and city life are sharper in Dickens' novel. Pip is sent to London to learn how to be a gentleman after he comes into his mysterious fortune, as if the city is the one obvious place for a landless boy without family connections to go to become someone and to satisfy his ambitions for social status. The overpopulated city is filthy and unhealthy, a place of prisons, law courts, counting houses, slums, and crime. There is a strangeness and an anonymity about living in the city that is starkly different from village life, where everyone knows everybody else. It's a place to be unknown, to lose one's name or change it to something else. A place where the restraints of history and identity are loosened to such a degree that a great deal of improvisation, fabrication, and self-making becomes possible. The city is also an imperial center of finance, commerce, colonial rule, governmental bureaucracy, industry, culture, and modernity itself, a worldly place that shrinks everything around it to provincial obscurity. One of Charles Dickens' major contributions to the art of the novel is his ability to claim this vibrant, dangerous, modern urban life for the art of fiction. But Great Expectations, of course, does not begin in London, and it is about much more than just a city. The novel's opening setting, with its treacherously slippery marshlands at the outer edges of the eastern shoreline, are the very image of an uncertain foundation for the building of a life. The landscapes in the book correspond in some ways to its central character in all of his various stages of becoming a person. By this personhood I mean the attribution of an identity, the assumption of the rights and privileges of citizenship, respectability, social acceptance, and the accrual of value. In addition to noting the physical locations and their symbolic significance in the book, we should also be alert to how Dickens extends this picture of a world to include a more general atmosphere or tone that shrouds Pip's story and projects something of his personal sense of loneliness and isolation. Of course, the other thing settings are doing in the novel is amplifying the troubled childhood and dysfunctional violence of Pip's first household with Mrs. Joe. In addition to this unusual, difficult-to-sustain childhood, Dickens places Pip's particular situation against a backdrop that seems itself existentially bleak. Of course, this description of the outer world may be colored by Pip's harsh circumstances, but it ends up pervading the tone of the whole novel, which doesn't seem to offer any silver linings. The passage I have in mind can be found on the top of page 86, and it goes this way. Quote, Joe made the fire and swept the hearth, and then we went to the door to listen for the chaise cart. It was a dry, cold night, and the wind blew keenly, and the frost was white and hard. A man would die tonight of lying out on the marshes, I thought, and then I looked at the stars and considered how awful it would be for a man to turn his face up to them as he froze to death and see no help or pity in all the glittering multitude. End quote. Now, on the surface, at least, this is an image of existential dread, but psychologically, its descriptive elements are the result of something profoundly personal. Pip is thinking, perhaps only slightly consciously, of Magwitch lying outside, but in another more subtle reference to the remote stars, we have a linguistic connection to a name that means star, Estella. So the projection of these other figures who will play a large role in shaping Pip's identity informs this description in yet another way. Pip is identifying with Magwitch's exposure. Remember how frequently Dickens has Pip compare his burdened leg with Magwitch's iron-bound leg, but also foretelling the suffering Pip will endure by turning his eyes toward Estella. It might be said here, too, that Pip's excessive desire for Estella's love and attention emerges as overcompensation for the extreme withdrawal of motherly and, by extension, female love he's been accustomed to. To put a real fact behind these despairing settings and cravings for love, consider the opening of Great Expectations as in part a fairly graphic depiction of what nowadays we call child abuse. Look, for example, at the passage on 97 and 98. I quote, "My sister's bringing up had made me sensitive. In the little world in which children have their existence, whosoever brings them up, there is nothing so finely perceived and so finely felt as injustice. It may be only small injustice that the child can be exposed to, but the child is small, and its world is small, and its rocking horse stands as many hands high, according to scale, as a big-boned Irish hunter. Within myself I had sustained from my babyhood a perpetual conflict with injustice. I had known from the time when I could speak that my sister, in her capricious and violent coercion, was unjust to me. I had cherished a profound conviction that her bringing me up by hand gave her no right to bring me up by jerks. Through all my punishments, disgraces, fasts, and vigils, and other penitential performances, I had nursed this assurance, and to my communing so much with it in a solitary and unprotected way, I in great part refer to the fact that I was mortally timid and very sensitive." End quote. The following description from one of the earliest scenes in the novel is perhaps the most symbolically dense rendering of the world in which Pip finds himself and how he views that world. The marshes were just a long black horizontal line then, as I stopped to look after him, and the river was just another horizontal line, not nearly so broad nor yet so black, and the sky was just a row of long, angry red lines and dense black lines intermixed. On the edge of the river I could faintly make out the only two black things in all the prospect that seemed to be standing upright. One of these was the beacon by which the sailors steered, like an unhooped cask upon a pole, an ugly thing when you were near it. The other, a gibbet, with some chains hanging to it which had once held a pirate. The man was limping on towards this latter, as if he were the pirate come to life, and come down, and going back to hook himself up again. It gave me a terrible turn when I thought so, and as I saw the cattle lifting their heads to gaze after him, I wondered whether they thought so too. I looked all round for the horrible young man, and could see no signs of him. But now I was frightened again, and ran home without stopping. One of the first things you may notice is the flatness of a landscape that is radically reduced to horizontal and vertical planes. The color palette is also limited to shades of red and black. Although the cattle are mentioned, the place cannot really be said to resemble an agricultural area. There are no meadows, no undulating hills, no farms to be seen anywhere. That would suggest a different kind of economy, a different rhythm to life and labor that is closer to the business of wharves and docks, points of entry and departure of goods, resources, human cargoes. The regularity imposed upon the natural landscape resembles or evokes the bars of a prison, and indeed the gibbet that sticks up vertically in the distance is an instrument used to detain criminals. The only other vertical structure visible to Pip is a beacon, which again gives a clue to the business of this lonely outpost by its function of guiding ships at sea. In other words, this is a landscape in service to the burgeoning industrial economy that marks this period in English history, and the place we are in is the place where England touches the rest of the world. England at this point is profiting from its newly established colonies, importing and exporting materials to the far reaches of the globe, And as I said before, the ports of Kent are used to ship criminals from England to the penal colonies established by the British government in New South Wales, Australia. The mathematically precise lines, or grids, Pip mentions, suggest the rationalization, mechanization, and regimentation necessary to operate such a vast industrial economy and to impose an order over space, nature, and time that is antithetical to the economies of traditional rural life. Charles Dickens was 49 years old when he wrote Great Expectations, which was well after an enormously productive and successful career as the most popular novelist in the English language. Most of Dickens' previous novels were first published in monthly installments in magazines. The run would last for about a year, and then booksellers would offer the entire novel in 3 separate volumes. Before Great Expectations, all of these books underwent the same publishing format. They include the following famous titles: Sketches by Boz in 1836, Oliver Twist in 1839, followed by Nicholas Nickleby, A Christmas Carol in 1843, Dombey and Son, 1848, David Copperfield, 1850, and Bleak House, often considered Dickens' masterpiece, 1853. Dickens would die 9 years after the publication of Great Expectations, but this book is unique in his roster of works because he published it in an entirely different way. It was written in order to launch a new magazine that Dickens had just purchased and begun to edit, so he needed the right-sized story to fit its pages. It was a family-oriented journal called All the Year Round, which offered a shorter format for smaller novels than the 3-volume editions Dickens and other Victorian-era novelists were accustomed to writing. Dickens began with a book called A Tale of Two Cities, bringing it out in weekly rather than monthly installments. This meant writing very quickly to meet the deadlines. The magazine was a success and sold 300,000 copies when it first appeared on newsstands. Once the serialization of a novel ended, the whole book was published in a single volume. Instead of publishing Great Expectations in the usual 20 monthly installments, which would have made the book you're reading twice its current length, it was published, like A Tale of Two Cities, in 36 weekly parts. The novel was first published as a book by Chapman and Hall in 3 volumes, unillustrated, in July of 1861. The novel, more importantly, reflects a series of dramatic changes in Dickens' personal life as well as in his professional life. By the late 1850s, Dickens was the most popular writer in England, untouched in his reputation by any other novelist. He had had a string of unbroken successes. Then he wrote a novel called Martin Chuzzlewit, which didn't sell as well as previous titles, sending Dickens into a slight panic. Also by 1850, new novelists were beginning to appear in England and gained a foothold on the public imagination with their works. William Thackeray's Vanity Fair, written between 1847 and 1848, introduced a more sophisticated social criticism that appealed to middle and upper-class readers. George Eliot's early novels, including Adam Bede and The Mill on the Floss, showed new attention to novelistic form and a new interest in literary realism. We should also add to this growing list of new novelists the Bronte sisters. Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights had been a dramatic success with its use of Gothicism and romance. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and Villette featured humble governesses as their protagonists, and Anne Bronte had a bestseller with The Tenant of Wildfeld Hall. In fact, theories of the novel were beginning to emerge in a way unheard of in Dickens' early years. Novelists were becoming more concerned and interested in the aesthetic form of their work, in the range and types of characters they were representing, in things like tone and theme. All of this changed Dickens' conception of the novel at the time he wrote Great Expectations, and we can see this reflected in the very different kind of book it is in comparison to his earlier ones. The book, for instance, is more compact, having a smaller range of characters than his others. It's more tightly organized around a double plot that's a fairly complex interplay of manifest facts and latent mysteries. It's more concise in its writing style. It invents a first-person narrator whom Alex Wallach has referred to as trapped in the space of an omniscient narration. The characters are not randomly diffused through the text, but are intimately related to one another in a series of symbolic doublings. There were some significant personal circumstances behind the writing of the book as well. In the years leading up to 1861, Dickens' marriage was falling apart, and he began living a kind of secretive double life. He had had many children growing to young adulthood at the time, none of them showing much promise of success. 10 children, one of whom would be killed in India in 1863. Dickens had fallen in love with another woman after 22 years of marriage to Catherine Hogarth. The other woman was a young stage actress named Ellen Tiernan, who only reluctantly reciprocated his advances. There is something of Ellen Tiernan in the somewhat similarly named Estella in Great Expectations. In the 1930s, evidence came to light about the degree to which Dickens attempted to keep this affair out of the public eye. That evidence consists of the assumption of false names written in hotel guest books. Dickens would use a number of aliases over the years during this time of his affair, and he did write about his separation in a public manner much later. He at last separated from his wife in 1858, moving to Gad's Hill Place, just outside the marshlands of the novel's opening setting. In light of these personal subterfuges, we can see something of the obsessive guilt Pip feels for breaking the law, and we can partly account for the guilty sense of abandonment and deep sense of loss that formed the central theme of Great Expectations. Dickens' original ending of the novel featured a much briefer reunion of Pip and Estella from the final revised ending that we now have. Having shown his completed manuscript of the book to a fellow novelist named Edward Bulwer Lytton, Dickens was persuaded by him that Pip and Estella should come to a more satisfying understanding of each other and part with a bittersweet resolution. In a letter to his future biographer, Dickens comments on this revised ending by writing, "I have put in as pretty a little piece of writing as I could, and I have no doubt the story will be more acceptable through the alteration." As I mentioned already, the time setting of Great Expectations is well before the time in which Dickens wrote the novel. Pip, for instance, is most likely born in the early 1800s, and the narrative of his life takes us up to about 1820. A significant thing about this era is that the first Reform Bill of 1832 that legislated greater enfranchisement and social mobility in England was not even on the horizon when Pip comes into his Great Expectations. The political and social world Pip is born into is one in which the chances of a boy like Pip of rising from a blacksmith's apprentice are very unlikely. This should frame how we read the novel. Pip's sudden inheritance is the only way Pip could ever aspire to being a gentleman. This gives the novel a fairy tale quality, since this unlikelihood speaks to the entrenchment of the social hierarchy and makes the idea of social rising a fantasy. Also, it means that in lieu of civil rights, guaranteeing political representation, social capital is all the more dependent upon older traditions of affiliation and social distinction. Social capital simply refers to the expected collective or economic benefits derived from the preferential treatment and cooperation between individuals and groups. The most prevalent category of social distinction at the time is the designation of gentleman, which is itself a concept undergoing alteration during this period. By 1862, for example, the term gentleman designated members of particular families or holders of an official or professional rank, possessing certain physical, moral, and intellectual qualities associated with that rank, increasing stress on the moral over the social qualities, but must be a socially pleasant man. Also current at the time was this definition: a divinely ordained higher, superior class of men meant to govern and rule over those born to be governed and ruled. I want to turn now to the question of how a fictional autobiography like Great Expectations conceives of self-identity. What does personhood mean in this novel, and how does the author dramatize something as elusive as the making of a self with regard to Pip in particular? The classification autobiography already points us in the direction of an answer. The term literally means self-writing, or self-writing about itself. First-person narrations provide us with an I that tells its own story. But there is more to it than this. To understand and appreciate the sophistication of Dickens' grasp of the developmental stages in becoming a self, we need to consider several things. First, if one's position within a normative family can be said to exert a lot of influence on self-identity, then absences, dysfunction, deaths, and substitutions within the group that makes up the family will create various levels of desire, a confusion of roles, or other disruptions that propel characters to act and plots to get underway in order to repair or overcome those disruptions. The death of Pip's biological parents opens just such a wound and makes an opening for a surrogate pair of parents that fail to fulfill their normative gender and sex roles. Mrs. Joe is a sister forced into the role of a mother, and Joe is a nurturing male limited by his simple childlike nature. We also learn in passing that Joe himself was violently abused by his alcoholic father. Out of this failed family structure comes a profoundly unfulfilled void with regard to strong father figures and older female models of motherhood. This is why Magwitch and Miss Havisham, despite their serious defects, emerge very quickly to assume strongly influential parental roles in Pip's life. They are, it ought to be noted, much like figures from a fairy tale, which is appropriate given their outsized personalities and their inclusion in Pip's mysterious Great Expectations. Like parents, they exert the power to shape Pip's sense of self, but Dickens also uses them as archetypes of gender that go well beyond who these people are as mere individuals. Magwitch emerges as if from the grave of Pip's dead father, a figure who is described like a resurrection and replacement of that father. He's also described as dirty, hungry, powerfully built, and growling like an animal. He is a force of both exaggerated masculinity and of nature itself, and is, moreover, a criminal. One way to look at Magwitch, then, is as the embodiment of an entire sphere of human life, a result of experiences Pip has not yet had, but may need to become a fully realized person. On the other hand, when Pip is later sent to Satis House to keep company with Miss Havisham, he enters into a domestic sphere dominated by a woman whose maidenhood has been violently arrested in time. Here Pip must be exposed to manners and refinements that reveal his coarse nature by way of contrast as he transitions from a state of animal nature to that of culture. Miss Havisham commands Pip to play rather than work, or to turn his work into play. and doing so puts Pip at some remove from his natural self by making leisure time available to him. Each of these characters bequeaths something to Pip, and Dickens suggests that his encounters with such forces ends up bifurcating Pip's identity into two conflicting halves. At turns, Pip is attracted to and repulsed by Magwitch and Miss Havisham, but he also identifies with them. I'll have more to say about this bifurcation later, but for now I want to resume where I left off with how Dickens dramatizes self-making beyond placing Pip in relations with other characters. The making of a self-identity, then, seems impossible outside the articulation in language that expresses and then internalizes its own constitutive elements. That is, among the most important acts of becoming a person with a unique identity is the act of reading, and followed by the act of writing and speaking. Naming oneself is part of this process, and this is exactly what we see as the novel opens. You'll note that Pip cannot pronounce his family name properly, so he puts it aside altogether in a dismissal of his father. That inability to utter his father's name marks a lack or a lapse that suggests he is not fully possessing that family name. The Pip is missing fill up, so he is then free to call myself Pip, and comes to be called Pip by others. The grammatical structure of that sentence contains an active and a passive verb, a bifurcation that suggests Pip has agency in naming himself and no agency in coming to be called Pip. What we know or think about ourselves, in other words, is usually not quite aligned with what others choose to know and think about us. The various bifurcations in Pip's identity are also built into the novel's narrative structure. Even though it often seems to the reader that Pip is reporting his experiences as they are happening in real time, he's actually recounting them retrospectively from the point of view of his adulthood. We can also describe this as the dual nature of Pip's voice, on the one hand youthful and unknowing, and on the other reflective, thoughtful, and chastened by his past experiences. The name he chooses is appropriate. A pip means a small seed, but it is also the word used to describe the process by which hatchlings peck their way out of their eggshells. When Pip first speaks to us, he is reading and tracing his finger over the letters engraved on his family's tombstones. From here to the end of the novel, representations of reading and writing, calling out and hailing, obeying commands and providing scripted answers to them, all become phases in Pip's development as a person, an investigation that we will soon undertake in more depth as we go on.